Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third annual Cundill Forum. This is an event sponsored by the Cundill History Prize, by the Dean of Arts at McGill University, and by the Department of History and Classical Studies here at McGill University. We're part of a larger history festival of 3 events. So some of you might have had a chance to hear earlier on in the day the Cundill Lecture. This is a talk given annually by the previous winner of the prize. And tomorrow you get a chance to witness the unveiling, the decision of the jury who wins this year's prize. My name is Catherine Desbarras, and I'm going to be moderating the Cundill Forum for today. Just to give you a sense of the format, what this is all about. The Cundill Forum is, what we do is we choose a topic of public interest that's related to the craft of history. And so we bring together the 3 finalists, so 3 superb historians who've kind of made the cut by, and I must say, a very impressive jury as well. So we know that you've been through tremendous hurdles and that you're in a wonderful position to help us think through some of these larger questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by briefly presenting the panelists before I talk a little bit more about the theme that brings us together here. So I'm going to start with Rebecca Clifford, who's professor of European and transnational history at Durham University. And her, and I'll say very moving and very subtle book, Survivors' Children's Lives After the Holocaust, is one of the Cundill finalist works. So there are 3 finalists, and that's one of them. Marie Favereau is coming to us. She's a professor of history at the Université Paris-Nanterre. And her work is titled The Horde, How the Mongols Changed the World. History very much on an epic scale, also that also blew away the jurors and is a finalist for the prize. And Marjoleine Kars is a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And she too has written, I shouldn't say she too, but she's written an absolutely harrowing book, Blood on the River, A Chronicle of Mutiny and Freedom on the Wild Coast. That's the 3rd finalist. So the 3 of them are going to help us explore a question. And that question is, why do we rewrite history? Each of them, they're in starkly different fields. We have a Holocaust historian, a historian of the medieval Mongol Empire, a historian of Atlantic slavery. And each of them, I would say, has probably come into contact with the kind of historical rewriting that we fear, that makes us feel anxious, that we don't like, that we think does great damage in the world. What are we talking about? The kinds of rewriting where totalitarian regimes erase inconvenient facts, the creation of fake facts, distorted accounts of the past, marshaled for in the service of ideologies, racial or otherwise. I think maybe each of you has encountered some of that in your own field and in the history at large, connected to your own field. One could go on, and I'll say at the outset that Marie Favereau herself has recently written on precisely this topic. Some of you Canadians might have caught the Globe and Mail article. This is a Canadian newspaper. And she discussed precisely the way in which, from a kind of Chinese nationalist perspective, her book doesn't exist. You know, the topic of the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan, we don't do this, we don't go there. So if anybody wants to talk about that, maybe we can. So we're kind of familiar with that kind of rewriting history, and the topic often in public discussions strikes a note. It's an insult. We don't want to do this. But we can think of this term, and I think you're all used to thinking of it differently as well, in a much less sinister way. Indeed, we can even just start thinking about last year's Cundill Prize winner, Camilla Townsend, rewriting the history of the Aztecs. This is what her book did. This is what her talk earlier was all about. And she in fact invited us. Her title was very interesting. It was inviting us to contemplate the possibility of changing our minds on the Aztecs. And this kind of subtle, humble title, I think, is interesting. And it speaks to, after a year of having her book in the limelight and kind of, coming to terms with how difficult it is to tell a history a new way and have it stick in a way. So that's something we might want to think about it. But in any case, I think the three of you are really beautifully poised to help us think. Think about the question, why is it that the best, the most rigorous, the most ethical historians actually rewrite history? And don't just do it incidentally, but maybe it's a kind of fundamental part of what historians are up to much of the time. So that may seem counterintuitive to people who are not doing it, especially if you've got that idea of rewriting history that's kind of scary at the back of your mind. So what I'll do is let's just try and explore this question from a variety of angles. And I'm going to toss a first question out at you. Beginning with the thought that philosophers of history, these are the people who comment or who are thinking about not just this book, this topic, that topic, but the whole sweep of historical writing over time, different places. What is it we're doing when we're trying to make sense of the past? And a number of them have ventured the thought that every time we sit down to write history, we are in fact rewriting something somewhere, maybe many kinds of things. So can we just maybe start with that? And I thought I would toss it to you, Marie, first, because in reading the three books, I was struck by yours is the one where there's a more explicit and conscious articulation. I'm chipping away at a version of Mongol history that I don't like. So could you maybe comment on that? And what are you grappling with?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kate. Yes, I'd be happy to discuss that. It's a very important topic for me, absolutely. I would say first that rewriting history, for me, I would call it research. That's how I call research in history. So we have to reconstruct things, deconstruct things, bring new visions. That's really part of our work. But of course, what is very specific to historians is that we don't just express an opinion. This all is based on very hard work. So going back to the archives, seeing the documents, seeing the objects, there's a lot of methodology involved. This is really hard work. First, there's the hard work. Then we try to express something else, something different, something that comes from, deeply inside. And I would say also that what is perhaps specific to historians and maybe to scientists in general is that there's a collective aspect as well. Before we allow ourselves to express our new vision of history, we discuss with our colleagues. We sometimes argue, we express new opinions, and we exchange with them. And there's a lot of collective works before we allow ourselves to express a new vision of history and rewriting history. And perhaps also I could add to this that rewriting history can be a hard process. It's actually when you've been taught history in a specific way, in your childhood, in high school, when suddenly someone's come up, even if he's a very well-known historian, with a new discourse, with a new version of history, you can be really surprised, and it's hard to accept it sometimes. This is something I experience with my students. I tell them, the new research on the Mongol Empire, and they've been taught that either they've been taught nothing about the Mongols, they've never heard of them really as a big empire. Sometimes they've been taught that they were barbarians. and it's like the whole historiography on the Mongols and the nomads. And I bring something new to them. The fact that they were, they built cities, that they were religiously tolerant, that they have a very complex way of absorbing new people. So socially, it's very interesting too. And they have never heard of that. So, and that can be really difficult. They need to be prepared to be surprised. So and we also, as historians, we need to be prepared to be surprised by, let ourselves being surprised by something new. I have to say that, yeah, it's a long, difficult process, and it's also very rewarding when, based on document, you can show to people, well, look, what we've been taught until now, what we've heard is not the historical truth, and I think that's also something important.
So the idea of a mobile empire where that produced records, censuses. Yes. We don't expect people on the move to be producing. We think of, often when we think of empires, we think of imperial authorities as being opposed to mobility, yes. Not liking people moving around, trying to pin them down, being suspicious of people moving around. So are these perhaps some of the ideas that are yes. hard to push against?
Yes, absolutely. That's something also very important to understand. And that's why when I say we think about, we try to rewrite history, we also need to provide new, like, for instance, new maps or new kind of illustrations, because this is part of what we have in mind. We've seen the Mongols or, typical barbarians in a special way, or we are used to see maps always in the same way, like contemporary maps actually. Let's deconstruct all this and let's build new maps and bring to the public new kind of illustrations. It's very important because it helps us really to deconstruct, like to forget what we've been taught before, and to be ready to be surprised and hear something new and different.
Right. Marjoleine, if I might, I'm going to swing in your direction, and I'd love to hear more about the Mongol Empire. Your book, I started off by saying, Marie, there's some conscious writing against visions of the Mongol. That's less present explicitly in your work. There's a kind of clinical, meticulous, walking us through a revolt of enslaved people that turns into a revolution, and then there's a civil war dimension to it, and then a kind of really unfortunate ending. But as one wanders into your conclusions, one feels that you are maybe talking against, or you're trying to get us to see some bigger stories differently. And can I just venture a couple, and you tell me whether I'm, à côté de la plaque, as we might say in French, self-satisfied versions of Dutch history on the one hand, but also, contributing to the big effort of rethinking the age of Atlantic revolutions, which, we're inclined to think of as a pivotal moment in the progress of the world towards greater freedom, rights for more people. And then you very pointedly say and remind us through, and your story is not alone here, but more people in chains at the end of this revolutionary era. So, a very detailed picture, but maybe trying to get us ultimately to think differently about bigger stories. Is that fair? Or?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. and I think you're certainly right about the age of revolution, which for so long we have seen in terms of white revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, independence movements. Nowadays we add the Haitian Revolution to it, so that's good. But I'm trying to say that there were many more people in this time and age trying to think about a different world, a better world. and that we have limited ourselves too much if we're not willing to look at farmers' uprisings, slave uprising, native uprisings, and so on. I was also trying to think about the fact that we so often study slave rebellions as if they're somehow in a category by themselves. I really wanted to break through that. I had just written a book about the American Revolution. And when I found these records about Berbice and realized I could write quite a detailed story, I began to wonder whether this rebellion could in some ways be thought of in similar terms. We tend to think of slave rebellions as movements in which, of course, everybody wants to be free and everybody is working towards the same goal, just as we, in the popular imagination, often present the American Revolution, for instance. But the reality was much more messy. Some people were patriots in the American Revolution. Some people were pro-Britain. Large numbers of people didn't want to be involved in at all. And so part of my question was to think about our big slave rebellions, because most of them are quickly suppressed and they don't last very long, but this one lasted more than a year. When you have a big rebellion like that, for which you have such detailed records, does it turn out to be as complex? Is everybody working towards the same goal, or do people have different ideas in mind? What's the intellectual history of this movement? How did it work as a social movement? And then my third big thing I was trying to do was to make some sort of intervention in how the Dutch think about slavery. I'm from the Netherlands, even though I've been taught in the United States and I work in the United States. And in Holland, people are beginning to talk about race and racism. But there is often this idea that these are things that happen elsewhere, mostly the United States. And there's not always as much awareness as I think there should be that the Dutch had an extensive empire in the East and the West that was built on slavery and forced labor. So I thought, if I can find a topic that will allow me to tell a compelling story, then in the process, I might be able to teach people something about what was going on with their own history. And for that reason, I'm very glad the book appeared in Dutch, because it's more likely that people in Holland will read it.
It will get read and circulate. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Rebecca, do you feel like taking that on? The Holocaust, of course, is one area where we don't, the idea of rewriting Holocaust history certainly sets off lots of alarm bells, and you're not, that's obviously not where you're going, but was there some, what were you, Marie describes research as being so important. You find stuff, but often it starts with an itch, a sort of sense there's something not right about.
Marie said something that I wrote it down because it really spoke to me. I was thinking about this question of rewriting, and I thought, well, that's not really, how I see what I do. I see myself more as kind of repositioning, as if I'm standing in a new place and looking through a different set of eyes. But what Marie said that really struck me, where she said, we need to be prepared to be surprised. And I think this, it's not always an approach I took as a historian. It took me a long time to maybe get to the point in my career where I felt comfortable nourishing what is often a kind of intuitive sense that there's something, when you find something shocking, you should go with it. And it was only in writing this book that I realized why that's a good idea. And now it seems self-evident, but it took me a while. That if something shocks you, it's because it fundamentally challenges your own assumptions. Those might be your assumptions as a historian. They might just be your assumptions as a person. And if it challenges your assumptions, it's worth looking into. And I think that underpins the best rewriting. You go with that feeling like, why am I so surprised by this? And you run with it and see what happens. And I'm thinking of a couple of things. Well, actually, I shouldn't say a couple of things. Every single chapter of my book ended up hinging on something I found shocking. The one that really blew me away, the one that I still find shocking, was this discovery in looking at I look at 100 different children who survived the Holocaust in the book, and discovering that those who were returned to a surviving parent often fared worse than those who ended up in orphanages. That just so challenges are assumptions about the strength of the family, of the nuclear family, which of course are assumptions that are historically contingent too, right? And yet it was funny how hard it was for me to accept that. It took me a long time to accept it. And I've had so many readers say, I found this really shocking. And that, you know, I want to respond, good, great. That's what we should be doing as historians. We will necessarily have to reposition ourselves. We will necessarily have to, rethink history if we're going to run with that. And I also think I was thinking about what Marjoleine said about, not treating the specific subjects we write about as if they were categories off by themselves, but always seeing them as part of a bigger history. And I think also anytime we do that, we step out and we have to create something new. I spent a lot of time when I was writing the book thinking, okay, it is a book about child survivors of the Holocaust, a rather extreme life experience. But I've never really thought of it as a book about that. I've always thought of it as a book about memory and remembering your childhood and making sense of a difficult childhood or a chaotic childhood, which so many people have had. And in that sense, I always hoped that anyone could pick it up and read these stories and think, oh, I see a little piece of myself there. So I also love the way, the other authors here tonight have been thinking about, how we take this little example and we stretch it out and see how it illuminates a whole swath of human life. We will definitely get new histories when we do that.
You're good that you're talking, and you've brought up the question of children, and one of the wonderful things about your book is the focus on children that we don't we have histories of childhood, but this is this is not something that is all that common. So let me frame the question first in general terms, and then come back to the question of the choice of children. So if we do think about rewriting histories, refashioning them, being prepared to be surprised, all of those things, there are many ways it happens, comes about in our writing. And one of them is of course, a shift in perspective. And that sort of sounds obvious, but a shift in perspective, bringing in a new one, can be very startling and very revealing. Again, Camilla Townsend, her kind of relentless focus on the world as seen by the Aztecs, not being obsessed, not talking about human sacrifice. You expect that that's all they're going to be talking about. Well, no, there's poetry, there's daily life going on. And that was some of the effective surprise that her book produced. Gosh, we weren't expecting that about the Aztec. And it came from that shift in perspective. It's something that fiction writers do all the time to very powerful effect. And as I was preparing for this, I was just thinking, and the one that came to mind to me, and we've all got our examples, the British novelist Pat Barker, who's been thinking about war. Again, you're all dealing with violence and difficult subjects in some sense. Pat Barker talking about war has come to the Iliad and has retold it in a couple of books from the vantage point of, a captive queen. And it kind of sends shivers down your spine. And part of the revelation is, gosh, once I see things from that angle, there's a kind of huge awareness of blind spots, all the things we haven't been thinking about because we've been telling the story so often from this vantage point. I see each of you doing that in ways, some ways obvious, some ways not obvious. We don't, of course, just want to write history from one perspective, but does that conjure up anything in you? Does it set you thinking at all? And does anybody want to? And again, maybe Rebecca, starting with you, since again, the vantage point of children is so interesting. And of course, you do so much with it. I mean, you follow these people over time too. So.
Yeah. So there's two things, actually. I could talk about the histories of children, and I could also talk about trajectories. Maybe I can say a little bit about both. I think it's not novel to talk about histories of children. I'm not the only historian out there doing it. There's loads, but I think it's good to flag up that the thing we might call histories of children is fairly new, but there is a kind of older subfield called histories of childhood, and it isn't the same thing. Historians who study these histories of childhood, they look at how adults view children and how adults have tried to make sense of children. So maybe they look at things like education or child development or children's literature, and that's all really important. It's wonderful, and there's some of that in my book too, but it doesn't really tell us how children make sense of their own worlds. That is a really difficult thing to do. I think we'll have a chance later to talk a little bit about archives, and I can maybe say something about how hard it is to find children in the archives. But I think over the past 10 or 15 years, there have been more and more historians trying to write about children, as historical actors in their own right, seeing them as human beings who have both subjectivity, so they have their individual lived experience, and they also have agency, meaning the ability to make choices and to take actions. Children obviously have very limited agency because they are under the control of adults in so many ways. But I will be honest, in writing this book, it took me 6 years to write. And in those 6 years, I was also raising my own children from very, very small. They're older now. And I learned a lot from the experience of mothering my children at the same time as writing about children, because they really brought me to see that children are, I think, inherently subversive. You might want things for your children, but they don't necessarily want those things for themselves, and they aren't necessarily going to do what you have planned for them. And I see it in a daily life, in daily way in my own household, and I see it in every single one of the children in the book who took actions to kind of stymie and subvert and obfuscate the plans that adults had for them. And that's really, I think, something that historians haven't done until recently. And then, of course, the other thing I do is I follow them through their lives. And that leads to an approach to the past that's really a life history approach that looks at the trajectory of a life. And I was thinking about how fundamentally I see myself as a historian as being interested in ordinary people's lives. That's what motivates me. But I really think all the historians in the room tonight share that passion for the lives of ordinary people.
Absolutely. Can you give us just an example or two, because there are so many? I mean, your book is bristling with them, of children being subversive, of examples of. Can you recall any? I mean,
I can recall many.
Yeah, I mean,
there was one I was going to talk about later.
Okay.
I want to make sure I'm not repeating myself. Well, there was one I was going to touch on later, but actually that same sort of story happens often in the book. So you'll encounter, if you read the book, many children who they survive the Holocaust. They end up after the war in the displaced prison camps in Europe, and they want to get out. They want to get out of those camps and move on with their lives. And there are some schemes, including one that's a Canadian scheme, to bring child Holocaust survivors out of Europe and over to Canada or to Britain. There's a scheme in Britain too, or to South Africa, to Australia. But those schemes, those immigration schemes, only take orphans. So what you encounter a lot in the book is children working very hard to hide the fact that they aren't orphans. Now, we can come back and talk about this a bit later, but I just think that's a brilliant example of the agency of children. They are so proactive in concealing the fact that they have a living parent. They go to enormous lengths and sometimes keep up this pretense for years. It's very active. It's very deliberate. there's another example, I suppose I could talk, it's quite a disturbing example in a way. But I write a little bit about a child who is also in a DP camp. He's had absolutely horrific experiences during the war. And he's in this DP camp. He's managed to survive with his father, but his father dies of the results of some injuries he's sustained in a concentration camp. And this child is 10 years old and he is totally alone in the world. So he gets his hands on a gun and he shoots a German he recognizes as having been a camp guard who beat him at some point. And I thought this was really a very remarkable example of a child's agency. This is a little kid, I mean, younger than my son is now, and he takes this gun and he commits a kind of an act of retributive violence. I was really intrigued by this because I think, again, it's one of those things that challenges our assumptions about the innocence of children. Children can participate in violence too, in retributive violence. And I just thought that was such a fascinating example, not because it happened. I think it probably happened a lot more than we know, but because I still found it shocking when I encountered it. So I had to stop then and think about children as having the power to commit violence, even in this world in which they are obviously so very vulnerable.
Yeah, so a nice example of the surprises that we get as historians are, as you've all said, they can be shocking. Do either Marie or Marjoleine, the importance of shifts in perspective in historical writing as producing new ways of thinking about the past that have been particularly important that you think of? Are there any that come to mind that have really changed the field or that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, if I may say, I do agree with Rebecca on the fact that we really try to give back their voices to ordinary people. And it's not that easy, especially when you're a medievalist like me, and when you're used to work with written sources that were produced by and for elites, actually. And when you want to understand the life of, in my case, like ordinary nomads, herders in the Asian steppes, it's very hard. But there are different ways to do it. And one way that you mentioned, and that's also something that I heard Camilla Townsend's lecture, and I know her work, and I do agree with her on the fact that fiction can help us a lot. Fiction, the way like the greatest writers produce it, can help us to sort of like imagine what it was then. We need to do that. Maybe it sounds strange because we are also doing science, but we need also to build up narrative, and we need to bridge information. We need to make sense with the evidence we have. And for early periods, medieval period and earlier, we really need our imagination. Close our eyes and zoom out. Just forget the sources, just zoom out and try to think what about this world at that time. And so that's something I consider very important, very helpful as a historian. And there's something else also. I think I'm a medievalist. I work in the archives, but I also need to see the landscape. I also need to see the place I describe in my work. It makes sense when you're a contemporary historian, of course, but when you're a medievalist, maybe sometimes you think you just need to go to the archives and that's all. But no, I had to go to different places in what is Russia today and Central Asia and Kazakhstan, just see the landscape. Although I'm aware that, river courses have changed, things have changed, of course, but still, I need to see the steppe. I'm not from there. So, and this helped me a lot. And if I can just give you one example, something that changed my views of nomads, I realized that there were rivers everywhere. there was water everywhere. So these nomads were also river people. They were able to cross the river. They were able to also walk on the river during winter time. Those rivers were everywhere. And before, I had this idea of, Mongols and nomads as riders in the steppe, like, grasslands, forest maybe. And then I discovered all the rivers. I went also to Mongolia and I discovered the mountains and the high hills. And everything changed, and it helped me really to, imagine these ordinary herders in the 13th and 14th centuries. And at last, I would like to add that I used to help myself. I use also archaeology. I'm a historian, but burial discoveries are very important objects. This gives us insight into the life of ordinary people. That's the only way sometimes, because in the written sources, it's very much about the king and the elite women and men. But if you want to reach, different kind of people and even children, you need to go, when you're medievalist, to burials. And we need to be prepared to do that, even if we are historians, I think. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So a shift in perspective, it's not just a whimsy, and it has real consequences for the kinds of material and evidence that you're looking for and that you're working with. And the point about moving beyond, the kings and the officials to everyday life, means that you have to work with different records. So I think that
we might, of course, also shift perspective within one book.
Absolutely.
So in this book about the slave rebellion, I try to give their due both to the enslaved, but also to the Dutch and also to Native American allies, so that you can have a shifting of perspective within one story that makes people realize in how many different ways something like a rebellion, for instance, can be experienced. And that is both a narrative challenge, but it's also, I think that's one that's enriching for the people who read it. And then in my case, the book was built on 900 testimonies, which until then historians had discarded. Historians who had looked at the rebellion had said, well, there are all these testimonies, but we don't want to use them because we know Black people lie. So talk about a shift in perspective. The entire book is built on sources that had until then been rejected, a little bit like what Camilla was talking about earlier today. Yeah,
absolutely. So there are sources out there that, that are hiding, in some sense, have been hiding in plain sight. Yes. And it's, there's a kind of shift in the way we see the world that makes us notice them. So I have a sort of related question. Again, thinking carefully through this business of rewriting and historians rewriting. And that is, and it's just come up here, we absolutely have to be faithful to the records. The records are our anchor to reality. That's just a starting point. We all agree on that. But we do much more than report literally. Again, this is sort of obvious, but we don't just report literally on what the sources say. We have to, and we put what historians would call historical distance between, the writer of history and the documents. We want to be true to the documents. We want to be true to what people say and how they lived, but we don't see things exactly in the same way. So there's this dance between truth to the records and making sense of them, viewing them critically. And Marjoleine, you mentioned this extraordinary cache of court records, and you described using testimonies, especially in this fraught context. At one point in your book, it's like looking through a hall of mirrors. So can you just use the example maybe of court testimonies in a sort of revolutionary setting? Why can't we just read them? Why can't we just read them and, tell the reader what they said and that's it? There's more going on though, no?
There is. And I think that the question of distance is an interesting one, because of course, when you're writing about a slave rebellion, much of the evidence is written by the enslavers. It's racist, it's self-serving, it's ethnocentric. And so obviously you do put quite a bit of distance between yourself and that evidence, and you're trying to figure out why are they phrasing it the way they do. I mean, stuff historians normally do. But then on the other hand, I have this testimony produced by people under duress, right? They're in court, kangaroo court. They're talking for their lives. They're trying to say things that won't get them in too much trouble. But there are other people around who have seen what they've done, so they can't just make up exactly what they want. And there, I feel that the challenge was not so much distance, but how to get closer, how to figure out who the people were behind that testimony. What are they not saying? What are they really saying in their sentences? And that is all compounded by the fact that this is testimony that has been translated from Creole or African languages into Standard Dutch, that has been rendered into the third person by the clerk who is taking it down. So the layers of distance are really great. And the challenge becomes how to bring this closer and how to bring those folks closer. So I think as historians, we have an interesting dance between keeping distance and being transparent about how we read our evidence, but also employing empathy, for instance, as a tactic in order to get closer to the people who have hitherto been either not regarded as consequential at all or just completely silenced.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we not betray the people of the past that we write about? And that's a huge challenge. And one of the challenges, of course, is that we do write in the present. We are affected by the present, and that, brings up new questions. But how do we do that without making the present drown out the past? I'm watching the time go by, and I think maybe I'll just ask one last question, and then we can hear from the audience. And my question is, the present does indeed intrude on our writing of history. People talk about a historical moment. I can say for sure that the financial crisis of 2008 produced a kind of sea change in historical writing. One of the things it did was make people much more attuned, a kind of return to economic history, thinking through the material conditions of economic life that people had been, they'd been, moving maybe in a cultural direction, and or you can't talk politics without dealing with economics. So 2008 has clearly been, it's clearly affected. It's produced, a whole field of histories of money, for example, something that I'm interested in. But so historical moments matter. And so to that end, I have a question about the moment we're in. I mean, we're in a moment where we're sharing very difficult things. We're sharing pandemics. We're sharing climate crisis. We're sharing it profoundly unequally. That's also become abundantly clear. Is this producing a need for new histories? I heard a poet recently say what we really need to do is plant trees. Is there a need for new histories? Do you see any emerging out of this? Where do we go from here, kind of thing? Do you have thoughts about that? About the present moment impinging on you as historians, or on others for that matter? Is it affecting you?
I think certainly in the United States, where at the current moment, the history of Black people, the history of race and racism are under such attack. Writing about these subjects is absolutely crucial. And I also think that given how much people are struggling with what is true, where do we get true news, that I really hope that historians will continue this trend of writing more accessible histories in which we are transparent about how we use our sources, how we think about our questions, so that people can sort of follow our trajectory as we create meaning. And they begin to understand how historical meaning is created, and ideally in ways that make our books compelling, so that people read them more. Because the lack of historical awareness, which seems to be growing, I think is absolutely frightening.
Yeah. Rebecca and Marie, does this get you thinking?
Well, I can jump in, but it's a little bit off-piste maybe. But I was thinking about it as I was preparing to come here this afternoon/evening with all of you, about how we're talking about rewriting history, but you could also talk about historians. I think it's amazing to look at this panel, and we're all women. And I know it's not a first for the Cundill Prize. I know they've had a group of all female finalists before, but it's unusual, right? It's different. And it made me think about, this act of changing our perspective in history. It's going to happen if you change what historians look like. Of course it is. Mm-hmm. But what occurs to me in our present moment, I think this is probably true in Canada and in Europe as much as it is in Britain, is that the field of history, of being a professional historian and working in an academic setting in a university, has become more and more precarious. Those tuning in from Canada or elsewhere outside of Britain might know that British universities are on strike this week. And one of the issues that we're striking about is precarity in the workplace. And who gets, caught in this dangerous web of the precarious situation is very often women or historians of color or disabled historians. Exactly those perspectives that are going to change the way we think about the past. So I think, in a way, that is a slice of the present moment that is troubling, actually. It's terribly hard to, I speak from a privileged position. I have a permanent job, but watching young people, watching my own doctoral students get to this point where you can effectively fall off a cliff at the end of your PhD, and we just don't have the safety net there to help get them through so they can write the books that we want to read, so they can tell, us stories of different people through different perspectives in an accessible way. That troubles me.
So precarity is part of the moment in which we write. Marie, do you want to add anything there?
I would say also that, as all of you, I'm sure I was, really shocked by the recent COVID crisis, and it's, many things we thought we took for granted. Now we know, like traveling easily, modernization, belief in technology, all this, I think, is crumbling down. And this means that we need to be really maybe more, modest in certain ways, and also think about the world of today and the past differently. And I do think we need more. I think we do need a lot of history. I feel that, like, seeing all my students, many of them are not, rich students, but they need to understand the world they are in. And also I realized that I was privileged because I was able to travel in many places that for many of them, young people, it's like, they can see it through internet, on the web, they can see photos, but going there, if you want to go today to China, Mongolia, Russia, it's difficult for a number of reasons. And I think that, this is really changing perspectives, and we really need to, in our, I think that one of the effects of this is that we see ourselves more and more, we and younger people, as citizens of the world, in a sense that I write on Mongols. I'm not a Mongol, and I have no family connection with any Mongol families, but I feel concerned by the past and by their history. And I think that's something we can really share now, this idea that this is, there's a common history. It's human history, and we feel for, very different people, and we feel the connections. So that's maybe this is something really new. And if I want to say something positive, yeah, that would be the positive side of it. But yeah, of course, we are really part of a global world, and we feel it very deeply now, and we have to address it, we historians, I think.
Right. And how do we, how does that translate? I mean, it's clear that Marie, your history was an example of this. We need multiple languages. You cannot. Can you just say a word about that quickly? I mean, a lot of the histories that allow us to break down the barriers that exist are histories that cross over linguistic lines. The Aztec sources. Cold War histories being rewritten because we're reading Chinese and Russian, Middle Eastern sources. Chinese as well as, say, American and Russian. These are some of the works that are contributing to break down
and this
boundaries.
Reminds me something Marjoleine just said about this dance between distance and being closer to the people of the past. This thing about language is key. We really need we need time and a peace of mind to learn those languages, because this is the only way to get close, at least, if we can say close to these people of the past of other countries, and to read other archives with new eyes. We need to learn the language. Then after that, we can create the distance we need as historians. But first, we need to get closer to them, and this is really we have to do it by learning languages, and that's something that is. But I think that's a main tool for historians, and it takes a lot of time. And here, if I can bridge with Rebecca, what you said, I do agree with you. Precarity for students when they have to learn several languages, it's really hard. So they need support for that. And so historians usually need to learn different languages, and that's really part of their background, and it's hard and important. Yes.
Right. Absolutely crucial to dealing with blind spots. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. And this is, coming back to the question of the other kind of rewritten history, the history that's troubling, the, nationalist rewritings that, removes Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire, that kind of thing. So not everyone but is well versed in the research, can bring big books and years poring over the sources to the table. How do those who are outside the field challenge, complicate the views of the past that we know to be incomplete? How do we encourage people to think critically about received histories and new ones alike? Anybody have any thoughts on that? We try and do this in the classroom, but of course our university classrooms are there's a lot of self-selection that goes on. I mean, we're not necessarily dealing with, though in some subjects we are. Any thoughts about that?
Well, if I may, when I have given talks, for instance, in Guyana, people have been extremely keen to talk about the sources that I used and to say, why are those sources in the Netherlands and in Britain? How come they're not here? And we should be able to read them. And of course, they're in Dutch, and people don't read Dutch. And so there is, I think, an enormous hunger out there for on the part of many people to know their own history better. And I think one of the things we have to do as richer nations is to make it possible for folks to do that research, to make records available online, to support young people in other countries to come and learn, for instance, Dutch, so that they can read and write their own history, and they don't have to rely on somebody like myself to write it. So I actually think there is a real interest in history out there that with the right tools, we can make more accessible to people. And public history, of course, is a field that's trying very hard to do that, where historians work with people in the community to see what questions they have, rather than always bringing our questions to the table.
Right. Rebecca and Marie, do you want to have a go at that?
If I can add to it, because something Marjoleine just said made me think about it. one of the things I read about in Survivors is how the children in the book, obviously I look at them through the course of their lives, they're not only children in the book, a lot of them have no idea where they've come from. They don't know who their parents were. They don't know what their hometown was. They can't tell that origin story about themselves. And so they have to become historians of themselves, to literally digging around in the archives, trying to figure out who they are, trying to fill in the details, because it's a terrible thing to not be able to say where you're from. That's a kind of very fundamental part of our way we explain who we are. And so I follow some of them through the course of their lives, learning to be historians, in down to the nitty gritty of how you get your foot in the door of an archive if you don't have an academic staff card, and how you do that work and how you think critically about what you find. And some of the people in the book, they never went to university, but they're incredible at thinking critically about the documents they find, because their lives are literally riding on it. So I just hope anybody out there who's having this thought could take a page from that and say, and feel empowered. You can do it. You'd be amazed to find how quickly you can do it if you have to. And you can think critically. The tools are there in the public sphere. You don't have to be trained as a historian to do that. It helps, but you don't have to be.
Marie, do you want to?
I do agree, really. And I think that also that if I think at myself as a professional historian, this is really, I do believe that this is part of my work, to translate what I do, like sometimes very narrow research, to wider audience and to exchange. I've tried different things. I've tried podcasts and videos, but I think what I like the most is comic books. I've participated, they were a collective project, and we worked on those comic books. They were not only for children, also for young adults and, grown up. And this was so interesting. I learned a lot, working with drawers who had to, we needed some kind of interesting information on, horses and clothing and landscapes, and I learned how to tell story differently. It was very rewarding because I could reach different audience. I found it fantastic, and I think that we historians also, and I think we are ready for that, but it's good to open doors and to say, okay, I can do my very technical articles to discuss with my colleagues, but I can also do more works for a wider audience, and that's also part of what we should do. That's really part of our job, I think.
Right. And Marie has, as she says, walked the talk with a graphic piece on Genghis Khan, right?
Yeah.
So it's out there for you to look at. So the hour has flown by, and it's time to close. So I want to thank you all, Rebecca Clifford, Marie Favereau, Marjoleine Kars, for a wonderful conversation, very thoughtful, and thank the audience for being present as well. So a reminder that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time, 6 p.m. GMT, you can witness the final event of the Cundill History Prize Festival, the winning ceremony. I'm so glad I don't have to make this choice. It would be an excruciating decision to make, that the jury has to make. But for the time being, you've all had a taste of some of what these extraordinary historians have to offer. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. It's very late for some of you. So off you go. And
it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate.
Yeah.